All right, welcome back to NextGen In-House Part 3. Troy and John here, ready to get forward with our next session. Super excited with the way Part 1 and 2 came out, and we're really happy with your feedback, and we're just very much appreciative of what you guys have been saying. So keep up the interaction. We're super thankful for it. And let's get into Part 3. Today, what we're going to be talking about is victory. And not just any old victory, but certain victory in Jesus Christ, the best kind of victory. And we're going to start out with looking at Psalm 62, and we're going to jump right into the word here. So Psalm 62, we know this is a Psalm of David because it tells us so. And we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 8. So to get right into it, here's what verse 1 and 2 say. I wait quietly before God, for my victory comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will never be shaken. I just love how right off the bat, he says, I know where it's coming from. It's not from me. It's not from my situation. It comes right from God. And even much, he says, my fortress, and I will never be shaken. I love that certainty that he puts forth.
Yeah, and it's like what we were talking about last week. Even sometimes in fear and doubt and confusion, God sees us, right? And the more we get to know who he is, we can be certain that the rock will always be something that we can count on. And we mentioned it a little bit last week, and even this morning we were talking about how Jesus needs to be the anchor. Mm-hmm. In everything that's going on in the world today. I really feel bad for people who don't know Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Mm-hmm. Like, what do you have to turn to? What is it that you're standing on? What is your hope in? You know, and when you think about even simple verses that all of us know, the Jeremiah 29:11, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus gives us a hope and a future. There's always victory in him, even in the most dire of circumstance, even when it looks like there is no hope, there is.
There is.
Because he is there.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And that's cool because that's even furthering on in this psalm. He talks about that. So we're picking up back in verse 3, and here's what David's saying. So many enemies against one man, all of them trying to kill me. Hopefully none of you guys are in that situation. But it gets more relatable. To them, I'm just a broken down wall or a tottering fence. They plan to topple me from my high position. They delight in telling lies about me. They praise me to my face, but curse me in their hearts. I hope none of you have experienced that, but unfortunately, I'm sure some of you have. But here's the cool part about this, what he says in the next couple of verses. Verse 5. Let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will not be shaken. A call back to the earlier verse. Dude, I love that. Mm-hmm. He's like, I don't care what people are saying about me, what I might not know they think about me. They might see that I'm just a broken person, but you know what? Let them think what they want, because I've given it all to God already. I'm already gone forth with him, and my hope is in him and him alone.
Yeah, and we have to remember who's writing this psalm, right? It's David, you know? And so you think of David, and you think, well, he's the guy who knocked out Goliath. But yet, he was dealing with some inner struggles of identity of who he was. Right. Which, you know, you got to remember, too, that this is before Jesus, right? So he was anointed to be king, which is totally different than us on the other side of the cross of Calvary, where we're in Christ now. We're, you know, God has made his home in us, and we can stand on the rock in a different way that he could. Yeah. You know?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And even on this verse, that's why this verse is so cool, because it keeps furthering what we're talking about and keeps pointing back to where David realizes his victories are coming from. And it says in verse 7, my victory and honor come from God alone. He's my refuge, a rock where no enemy can reach me. And then he gives us this verse of encouragement. He says, oh, my people, trust in him at all times. Pour out your heart to him, for God is our refuge. Something that I made a note of was right there in verse 8, when he addresses us, his people, to pour out your heart to God. I think that's something that is easy to pass over, but is so critical because that's a point where that's like our biggest moment of weakness as a person.
Right.
When you're pouring out your heart to someone, because that means you ultimately trust them with everything. And it's no longer about your ego. It's not about you keeping up this wall or this mask of I'm okay. You're breaking all that down and being truly intimate with whoever it is you're pouring that information out to.
Yeah, there's a couple things here that I want to point out too. Is like verse 5, where it says, "Let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in Him." And there's a lot of different stories in the Bible where people start out with a lot of hope and a lot of trust and a lot of faith in God, and then something comes along and it knocks the feet out from underneath them, and they're not as sure as they were before, because now they're looking at the things that are around them. They're thinking about maybe the things that somebody has said to them, like in this verse, right? And obviously David was dealing with some of those things. And if you know the life of David and the history of how he was anointed king, I mean, he wasn't even called into the room when the prophet of God was coming to anoint the next king.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So, there's definitely some family issues with maybe some things that he was struggling with internally, which are things that maybe a lot of us struggle with as well, especially in times where it just seems like so many things are uncertain.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's like the thing that we have to remember above all else is that there's a lot of questions that we're going to have with the way things are going, but we never have to question where God is and how He's going to end up in this situation.
Right.
He's always going to be up on top with that victory.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking about a story that kind of came up in our devotional time this week in Whisper, and just learning to listen and hear the voice of God. But it's Elijah and the prophets of Baal, because there's a perfect example of somebody who is anointed by God, called by God, has this relationship with God, has seen God work through his hands. And even with the story in the prophets of Baal, he has this tremendous victory over them, right? Yeah. All these prophets, 450 or so prophets, he goes up against them by himself, and God shows up in such a great way, right? So, he gets the stones, he gets the wood, he gets the bull, he cuts it all up, he pours water on top of it. He sees God, his tremendous, mighty hand come down and do a mighty work. Right. And then shortly after that, he falls apart. Right. Yeah. And it's because bad news came. It's because somebody might have said something or whatever. And so, like in times like these, we have to remember and remind ourselves of, the power of who God is. So if we pick up in let's go there. 1 Kings. We're in chapter 19 now. This is after. Elijah has now defeated all these prophets of Baal. And not only he's done that, he makes it rain after it hadn't rained in who knows how long, right? Yeah. There was a verse here in verse 46 where it even says this: "Then the Lord gave special strength to Elijah," right? And then in less than the very next chapter, he gets bad news. And in 19 verse 3, it says, "Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. For he went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. And then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day, and he sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die." And this is what he said to God. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." Like, have any of us come to a point where we've kind of said, like, I've had enough. Like, I can't do this anymore. You know what I mean? But he forgot that he wasn't alone. Right. That's what happened. So, like, what burned up the wood and the calf and the water and sucked all that stuff up was his faith in God. Just one chapter earlier. Right. And here, now, all of a sudden, no faith. He feels like he's alone.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's wild because when we're in those times of burning the altar of faith where it's like nothing can shake us because everything's just good and we just understand that God's got it, how sometimes it's so easy to fall off track and it gets really discouraging looking back and you're like, how could I be at such a high point and now I'm in this low valley? But that's when you understand that it's probably because you were alone or you thought you were alone.
You thought you were
You
alone.
thought you
See,
were
that's
alone.
that's the difference. You thought you were alone. And that ties into our story from last week, right? Jesus saw that they were having trouble from afar off, and he went to them.
Right.
You know, they weren't alone. And same thing here. He's not alone, but in his mind, he thinks he's alone.
Right.
And you know, you could look early in the story where he refers to himself being the only prophet left, right? And later on here, we see God reminds him, like, no, you're not the only one, and I've got
Yep.
many, many more just like you. So be encouraged. But let's pick up in verse 5. All right, it says this. Then he lay down and he slept under the broom tree. And as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." And he looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. He's in the wilderness.
Yeah, like
All right? So there's something supernatural, again, taking place. And once again, we see, like we saw last week, God, the angel of the Lord comes to him. God comes to him, and it's after he's kind of quieted himself. It says, right? It says here, then he lay down and he slept. Now, I read somewhere a while ago that the distance between where he was there in Beersheba and where he was in Baal was over 100 miles. So he had been running.
carrying that.
Yes, running, and think about the fear and the anxiety and the worry of, like, oh my gosh, someone now is going to kill me. And he felt like he was alone, put God on the shelf, and he ends up over here. And when he finally comes to a point where he's quieting himself and resting himself, God comes.
Right.
And you see just the nature of God, how he's comforting him and taking care of him and providing for all of his needs.
Right. Absolutely, man.